the Ukrainian government expects full membership in NATO. An invitation to NATO is also the first point of Zelenskyy's victory plan. The White House is beginning to show openness to this idea, although until recently, Biden was as categorically opposed to this scenario as Scholz. Today, sources who have, and I quote, good contacts with, the German publication names Benjamin Tallis, director of the Berlin Democratic Strategy Initiative and author of several publications for the German Council on Foreign Relations, as one of these experts. Tallis reports that after Zelenskyy's last visit to the United States, in fact, the Ukrainian president's team, as well as interlocutors in Washington, told him that he was now available, and I quote, space to move towards inviting Ukraine to NATO. The U.S. will also urge other countries to move in the same direction. This is the focus of the publication. We also recognize that the position of the United States as essentially the strongest member of the North Atlantic Alliance is very influential, and other states are guided by it. The U.S. is likely to reconsider the notion of inviting Ukraine to NATO. As a Ukrainian source confirmed to journalists, the Americans realize that a compromise on the cessation of hostilities is possible only if Ukraine receives security guarantees that will protect it from a new Russian attack. There are limitations to this issue. Some Ukrainian sources indicate that the U.S. government is considering revising its NATO invitation concept. The White House is considering that this may not be a traditional invitation, but rather a political statement with revised wording. At the same time, the sources add to journalists that there is no understanding of what this might look like. And of course, all such calculations will lose their validity if Donald Trump becomes president, the sources note, and the publication emphasizes and focuses on this again. In Ukraine, however, they see Biden's influence on NATO diminishing with each passing day as he approaches the end of his term. American diplomats know that Biden's fading political capital is a problem. Again, the authors of the article quote Ukrainian interlocutors. And in fact, this makes it even more difficult to convince allies who are hesitant to invite Ukraine, because even looking back at the position of the United States, in this case Joe Biden, partners and other NATO member states understand that very soon everything may change dramatically in the United States. It is even more difficult to convince Germany of Ukraine's accession and invitation to NATO in general than, for example, Turkey or Hungary. The day before, the American edition of Politico reported that at the moment, 7 countries remain against Ukraine's actual accession to NATO, the invitation to NATO. In addition to Slovakia and Hungary, the American publication all cites such countries as Spain, Belgium, and Slovenia, which are also, let's say, not active supporters of this idea, to put it mildly. But again, if we talk about these 3 countries, we understand that they are also guided by the position of Germany and the United States in many ways. Germany is still a categorical opponent of Ukraine's NATO membership, while the United States seems to be softening its position. In addition, we also have Turkey, so we can talk about 8 such countries. Changes are evident in Ukraine's position, with signs that Kyiv may be willing to make territorial compromises for NATO membership, the newspaper reports. This approach acknowledges that territorial concessions may be temporary, and that Ukraine's relinquishment of territories doesn't alter the requirement of international law for the complete withdrawal of Russian troops. No one legally recognizes Russia's occupation of these areas, despite its de facto influence over them for a time. In this context, the German newspaper recalls a number of public statements by Kyiv that indicate a certain softening of the position, starting in the summer of 2023, when the head of the president's office, Andriy Yermak, and Anders Fogh Rasmussen recalled the example of a divided but later reunited Germany. And indeed, we could hear and observe this dialogue and this discussion and the leaks since 2023, and perhaps even since the end of 2022. We also see Zelensky's statements that not all of Ukraine's territories need to be returned by force. There are some other new details that the newspaper draws attention to and writes about. Thus, Ukraine's plan and expectations today seem to envisage a scenario where the territories controlled by Kyiv are protected under the terms of NATO's Article 5, perhaps even with a buffer zone of about 50 kilometers from the front. If we talk about regional centers such as Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, or Dnipro, which are now closer to this distance to the front line, Kyiv could announce it won't attempt to reclaim the remaining territories occupied by Russia by force, the German publication reports. At the same time, Ukraine does not want to initiate this option and expects the U.S. to propose its NATO accession in exchange for the temporary occupation of territory. The reason for official Kyiv's hesitation is the fear of internal protests against territorial concessions. According to the newspaper's sources, the Ukrainian government also fears that Kyiv's peaceful signals could be used by some allies as an excuse to reduce arms supplies to the Ukrainian army. Because then the West might ask, why arm a country that is already ready to negotiate? As long as Ukraine's hopes are not dashed, it is assumed that the United States will initiate such a plan. The German newspaper's Ukrainian sources, who are familiar with the negotiations, do not see the United States making such an offer to Ukraine on its own initiative. The same sources suggest that the White House, on the contrary, prefers that the initiative come from Kyiv, in which case Zelenskyy would be directly responsible. In support of this position, both Washington and Berlin have the argument that for years they have promised not to decide anything about Ukraine without Ukraine. So, if someone in the West were to be the first to suggest to Kyiv the idea of inviting it to join NATO at the expense of territorial concessions, it could be perceived as a stab in the back of Ukraine. The West also does not want to take on these reputational risks, and if this were to happen, the Ukrainian side could later claim that such a relinquishment of territory was forced under pressure from the West. So, at the moment, in the contacts between the United States and Ukraine, each side is essentially maintaining a poker face, as the German press writes, i.e., waiting for the other side to make the first step in this direction. The newspaper draws attention to this rather extraordinary detail, a very specific problem of contacts between Kyiv and Washington. According to the journalists, it is the fact that Volodymyr Zelenskyy and his right-hand man, the head of the presidential office, Andriy Yermak, often speak English themselves during negotiations with the Americans, instead of wasting time on translators. But again, according to journalists, Zelenskyy's English is only mediocre, and Yermak's is downright bad. So, Americans, again, according to German journalists' own sources, are often unsure whether the parties understand each other correctly. Even the American side does not understand Ukraine's two leading politicians when it contacts them directly. U.S. officials also seem unable to assess whether their own explanations were understood by the Ukrainian authorities. When such fine details of the settlement of the war between Russia and Ukraine are being discussed, such negotiations require a deep knowledge of English.